Hyde. We're going to be reviewing how the Idaho legislature did in this latest session. And it's kind of like as a kid, when you had to explain your report card to your parents, sometimes the grades weren't that easy to explain. And sadly, this is the year that the legislature received a failing grade. Now, that's not because every legislator is terrible, but there are some definite problems, and we're going to tell you all about them in just a few moments.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Know Where to Hide. I'm here to talk about some of the things that are going on in Idaho that you may not get necessarily full explanation from the mainstream or legacy media. Now, that doesn't mean that I have all the answers, but I'm definitely looking at this from a different vantage point and encouraging you to think clearly and independently about what's going on. Right now, there's a lot of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and that's actually for some of the good things that have happened legislatively. But let's start with some of the bad news. And for this, we're going to turn to a report from Parrish Miller from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, 2024 wrap-up, the worst legislative session ever. Okay, that may seem harsh, and I need to say this because there were a number of legislators who were like, "Hey, we were doing our best, and what do you mean? Why are you criticizing us for not getting a passing grade?" Notwithstanding their heroic efforts, there's just a lot of inertia, and this comes from the establishment types, the people. "Oh, this is just the way that we do business," and yet it's not in keeping with the proper role of government, and that's a big deal. I know it's extreme, isn't it? But that's how you keep your freedom. That's how you keep your prosperity. It's how you keep your kids from waking up one day and finding out that they've been enslaved gradually, bit by bit, or even worse, trained to embrace their slavery as something necessary, which it turns out is something all of us have been indoctrinated into starting from about age 5. Do the math on that. You'll see it all comes together. So let's take a quick breakdown here of the legislative session. We'll start with the bad news first, okay? We'll get the punishment out of the way first. But understand, it's not about scoring political points. This is about holding legislators, elected representatives, accountable for the job that they do. And in this case, there were a number of legislators who clearly dropped the ball, which is what this is all about. Now, Parrish Miller says, look, there are too many variables to make a definitive statement that this is the worst legislative session in Idaho history, but it certainly ranks among the worst, and he will break it down for you. Thankfully, the Idaho Freedom Foundation provides us with a freedom index. And as I shared on the last episode, there are 12 different indices that can be used to measure whether something expands government, expands the cost of government, where it keeps it within its proper role, whether it diminishes, the size and scope of government or not. And these are very good, healthy questions that have to be asked. It's not about just scoring political points so much as keeping government accountable to the citizenry, because otherwise you end up with a uniparty problem like we see in Washington, D.C. Now, Parrish says this session has greenlit significant increases in government spending. It's expanded government, provided incredibly meager tax relief, even as inflation continues to plague those who work for a living. So if you've been feeling the heat, pay attention. These are some of the places where the legislature could have done better. This session, budgets for government agencies were split up into a first round for maintenance budgets, and a second round for enhancements. By the way, this was one of the very positive things, that budgeting process. It distinguished between what's absolutely necessary to keep the lights on versus what would be nice to have. Now, we're talking almost entirely discretionary spending for that second category. The maintenance budgets totaled $12.1 billion. The enhancements added up to about another $1.5 billion. That's a lot of money, especially in a state the size of Idaho. Parrish tells us you would think it would be easy for fiscal conservatives to vote no on most of the enhancements, even if they felt compelled to vote yes on the maintenance budgets. Those are the budgets to keep the lights on and the doors open at government agencies. And again, this is not just about we got to punish the government agencies. It's about the recognition that the taxpayers are paying more for everything. Every time they gas up their car, every time they go to the grocery store, everything that we buy is costing more. Everybody is feeling that financial pinch. Now, some courageous legislators did vote no on the enhancements, but the majority just kind of went along with growing government even more because I suppose that's the way that we do it, or at least that's how they tend to see it. So there was a modicum of trimming here and there, Parrish tells us, but the legislature passed the biggest Medicaid budget ever, a whopping $4.7 billion monster. There wasn't any reform in this budget, he says. It just continued an unsustainable program that relies increasingly on federal dollars that add to an unsustainable and potentially ruinous federal debt. Another big miss was the budget for colleges and universities. The maintenance budget provided $684 million to institutions that continue to push diversity, equity, and inclusion, as the Idaho Freedom Foundation has documented. The legislators, not satisfied with giving colleges just the maintenance budget, voted to give those colleges a $16 million top-up, effectively awarding them for continuing to stubbornly push that Marxist agenda. So here are some more specific breakdowns. These are places where the legislature failed to deliver. Education choice. Conservatives believe in education choice, but once again, the Idaho legislature failed to advance any meaningful proposals to allow parents and families the freedom to take their education dollars out of failing government schools and invest them in superior private alternatives. While a few decent bills were introduced, none gained any traction, and I think it was Jim Guthrie's drawer where he keeps the bills that really prevented most of these from seeing the light of day. By the way, I really appreciate the fact that Parrish uses some quotes from Milton Friedman to back up what he's pointing out here in terms of the violation of these principles of sound government. Milton Friedman said education spending will be most effective if it relies on parental choice and private initiative, the building blocks of success throughout our society. There are way too many people out there who believe, well, the sun wouldn't rise in the morning if it weren't for some government edict or some bureaucrat or functionary somewhere making it so. Also, a great opportunity missed was the belief in free markets. Parrish says, once upon a time, conservatives believed in free markets, where government kept its distance and allowed providers and consumers to engage in commerce free of government intrusion and manipulation. Now, unfortunately, the Idaho legislature seems to have other ideas, and this is in part because of special interest. It imposed the heavy hand of government on pharmacy benefit managers, motor vehicle manufacturers, and electrical contractors. They even voted how to micromanage how health benefit plans pay for contraceptives. Now, those numbers you see in the ellipses after each of these represent the score, the Freedom Index score for these respective bills. And again, you can check out the article in its entirety at idahofreedom.org. Also, there was the lack of support for free markets, which was evident in the decision to pass bills creating new government programs to facilitate government-approved improvements to commercial real estate and pursue a wide variety of grazing improvement projects. Now, fortunately, some of the bills that were even worse didn't pass. Those included proposals to create an adult workforce high school diploma program, to regulate how much a healthcare provider may charge for medical records, and to further tweak the cronyistic and redistributive launch grant program, which is one of the crown jewels in Governor Brad Little's cap. Many people want government to protect the consumer. A much more urgent problem is to protect the consumer from the government. Again, Milton Friedman weighing in here with some very timely wisdom. There was also the discouraging of government, or there was a missed opportunity to discourage government dependence. Republicans are supposed to oppose the expansion of the welfare state, but Idaho's supermajority Republican legislature still passed a massive expansion of Medicaid to trap more people in a destructive cycle of government dependency. They also chose to create a Medicaid budget stabilization fund, instead of giving that money back to the taxpayers, and to push for a state-directed payments program under Medicaid to funnel more money into this bloated system of socialized medicine. Boy, the crying was long and loud about taking away, or at least refusing to fund, a summer EBT card program for kids, which, again, looking at this, would teach them at a very early age to start feeling dependent on government for the very food in their mouths. Also, speaking of socialized medicine, the legislature passed bills this year to keep alive the unnecessary Immunization Assessment Board. It jumped back into researching maternal mortality, which, by the way, is a huge talking point right now for much of Idaho's media. Why are all of the doctors leaving? They want us to believe it's because Idaho has a very restrictive abortion law. It's much more than that. It's also because of falling birth rates and the growing age of Idaho residents. And it has a lot to do. It's not that, well, I became an obstetrician or I became an OBGYN so I could abort babies. No. The abortionists are the bottom feeders of the medical industry. And the doctors who are leaving Idaho, some of them may, aspire to be a bottom feeder in the medical industry. Most of them have other reasons, though, why they're leaving. And it's happening in other places as well, including places that don't have as strict abortion laws as Idaho. So good to question these things. Legislators also expanded government by creating an independent and unaccountable Office of Health and Social Services Ombudsman. Again, Milton Friedman reminds us we have a socialist communist system of distributing medical care. Instead of letting people hire their own physicians and pay them, no one pays his or her own medical bills. Instead, there's a third-party payment system. It's a communist system, and it has a communist result. That right there is causing a few people to grind their teeth. You can't talk about that like that. There was also a missed opportunity to support free speech. This session, Parrish tells us, we saw a number of bills passed or introduced to impose government censorship on everything from political speech and political memes to mobile phones, social media platforms, even advertising. And while all these bills were no doubt created with the intention of addressing perceived societal problems, the proposals all involved imposing more government limitations on our free speech rights. Milton Friedman would say concentrated power is not rendered harmless by the good intentions of those who create it. Also, there was a missed opportunity for healthy skepticism of the criminal justice system. I don't know what it is. Why do people get so gaga and starry-eyed over, you show them somebody in a uniform and it's just, oh, may I touch the hem of your bulletproof vest or something? We have to question the criminal justice system because sometimes the system is more about protecting itself than it is about justice. One of the most disturbing developments this session was the number of bills introduced that included mandatory minimum sentences for crimes, ranging from the severe to the incredibly minor. As Parrish points out here, the problem with mandatory minimum sentencing laws is that it's always possible for extenuating circumstances in a specific case to make a mandatory minimum sentence manifestly unjust. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws fundamentally subvert the notion of justice, which requires broad judicial discretion in sentencing. That's why we have judges, right? They're not just a robot here to rubber stamp, data input, yes, guilty, okay, here's what we have to do. They have laws to follow, but they have to exercise judgment and discretion. As Parrish Miller says, the desire to reshape society by doubling down on the criminalization of vices and speech that legislators find offensive or immoral represents a disturbing departure from a belief in limited government. And as Milton Friedman would put it, there is no place for government to prohibit consumers from buying products the effect of which will be to harm themselves. Put another way, in the words of Lysander Spooner, vices are not crimes. They're mistakes that people make in their pursuit for happiness. Something that would be very well for all legislators to remember. The conclusion that Parrish Miller comes to is to those outside the process, Idaho appears to be a conservative state with a Republican supermajority in the legislature and a full slate of Republican constitutional officers. But he says for those of us in the trenches, the reality is very different. Affiliated Democrats do represent a minority, but ideological Democrats who style themselves as centrists or part of the Main Street Caucus, they're part of a growing contingent that, along with the affiliated Democrats, is pushing our state down the same destructive path that has devastated Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. We are definitely on that path. Republicans could have used their majorities to cut spending or pass education choice or slash the welfare state, defend free markets and free speech, and push back on overcriminalization. Instead, Idaho is moving in the wrong direction on every important issue, and that is why Idaho's 2024 legislative session earns an unqualified F for failing our state, abandoning conservative values, and expanding government across the board. Now, this is going to be something that I'm sure will be mentioned in the primary elections, which are coming up, as well as we're going to see, in the general election. There are a lot of legislators who are running, and on name recognition alone, you know me, I'm a common sense conservative. And oh my gosh, the number of cowboy hats, really, we're dressed up in Idaho drag here, to show I'm a fifth generation Idahoan. It's their actions, not their words or the costumes they may put on for a political photo op. What are they actually doing that is in keeping with the proper limited role of government or proper accountability? The answer is, for many of them, yeah, they're making the motions, they're talking the talk, definitely not walking the walk. All right. That's the bad news, okay? So if you're feeling, if you're a legislator and you're feeling picked on, it's okay. You can do better. We want you to do better. We want you to succeed, but we want you to succeed at those things that are actually consistent with freedom and the proper role of government. Now, there were a few things that are worth celebrating, and let's take a look. I think it was Heather Scott who pointed out a couple of very, very big wins that have taken place here recently. Maybe you heard about these just in the last few days. Heather says Democrats and some little r Republicans are livid that they can't hurt children now that conservatives have banned the murder of preborn children. That would be Idaho's restrictive abortion law, banned genital mutilation and irreversible hormone treatment of children. This is the one that was just upheld by the Supreme Court just last week, and says, yes, Idaho can enforce its law against so-called gender-affirming care on minors. And also, we have a law now that removes adult material from the children's section of the library and provides a way to keep it separated from kids. Now, Heather Scott says, look, they've created an industry on this and keep throwing the medical, library, and education professions under the bus. We absolutely have to reclaim doctors, librarians, and teachers away from those who want to destroy children's innocence. And it has been interesting. I mean, the ACLU and the Democrats of Idaho, the Senate and House Democrats, they are just incensed. How could this be? How could we be such a terrible state? And yet there are, I think, a lot of us, and I would consider us, the normal people, who say, thank goodness somebody finally has been able to put their foot down and establish a boundary. And that's really what this is about, boundaries around the children. But for some reason, corrupting those kids, whether it's through murdering them before they can be born to inconvenience our lives, or whether it's trying to twist their little minds into doing irreparable harm to themselves in the name of some social contagion called gender dysphoria, or whether it's trying to entice them through adult material in the children's section of the library. We put up some pretty serious boundaries here, and people are not happy about it. I wonder why that is. By the way, I do have to share one quick meme that I saw. I think it was the ACLU of Idaho that talked about, trans children are welcome, or trans children belong in Idaho. Okay, that's the mantra they're going to say, but this is really what needs to be said. Trans kids belong in therapy. That's not meant to be a cruel slight. That is recognition that what they need more than anything is they need therapy. They need the mental health treatment to help them come to grips with whatever it is that's causing the confusion for them. Taking permanent steps like surgical genital mutilation or giving them, puberty blockers that will forever stunt them, that's just not the way to do it. I mean, this is common sense stuff, and yet it's being portrayed as extreme. It's only extreme if you've allowed yourself to be brainwashed enough into thinking that somehow, indulging someone else's fantasy and allowing yourself to be drafted into that fantasy is somehow being kind. It's not. Sometimes kindness is telling the truth, even if that truth is something that they may initially take as hard. But at the end of the day, the goal here is protecting the kids from predators, which unfortunately have made incredible inroads into our libraries, into our schools, and yes, even into the medical profession, which is profiting obscenely from this gender dysphoria, so-called gender-affirming care that they're offering. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our